Vitor Belfort, a name synonymous with some of the greatest fights in MMA history and some of MMA's most legendary moments. From his front kick KO loss to Anderson Silva, to his title loss to Jon Jones after nearly finishing him earlier in the fight. Ouch. Yeah, history isn't always kind, but today we'll be going back earlier than all of this. Back long before any controversies, back to the young UFC. Not at Vitor's title losses, but at his lone win in a UFC title fight, and determine whether or not Vitor Belfort was a legit champion. Welcome back to the series, guys, where we take a look at the legitimacy of certain questionable or controversial UFC champions. Like and subscribe if you enjoy it, as it helps the channel massively when you do, and be sure to let me know who you'd like to see next. Long before any of his TRT controversies, and way before the shell of a fighter that we've been cursed to witness in the recent years, Vitor Belfort was once a young, surging up-and-comer. Going back to 1996, a 19-year-old Vitor Belfort was making his professional MMA debut. After winning his first fight by KO, Vitor would go on to enter the UFC 12 heavyweight tournament set for February the 7th of 1997, and would successfully win the tournament after two more impressive first-round KO finishes. After later going on to KO Tank Abbott in the first round of their fight in May of 1997, Vitor would find himself opposite Randy Couture in a heavyweight title eliminator. This would be the first matchup in a trilogy for Belfort and Couture, with each one having title implications. Unfortunately for Vitor, this first matchup would end in defeat, as he would be TKO'd by Couture at the 8-minute mark of the first round, and for anyone confused, the unified rules hadn't been constructed and implemented yet. The first rounds were just longer in general. Vitor would have two more fights in the organisation, a first round submission followed by a first round TKO over a young Wanderlei Silva, before leaving the organisation to compete in Japanese promotion Pride FC. After losing his first fight with Pride, Vitor would go on a 4-fight winning streak. This would see him return to the UFC on a high note at UFC 37.5 in 2002 to face a rising 10-1 Chuck Liddell. After losing the entertaining scrap by unanimous decision, Vitor would take a short period of time away from the sport, and after roughly a year away, would rebound with a first-round TKO victory over Marvin Eastman. Now, while Vitor had been away, previous rivals Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture had gone on to compete for the interim Light-Heavyweight Title. Couture would emerge victorious, and would then later go on to capture the undisputed title from champion Tito Ortiz later that year. This would set the stage for Vitor Belfort's first crack at UFC Gold in a rematch with Couture at UFC 46. And what followed was one of the greatest and most publicised freak events in MMA history. In the opening seconds of the bout, Couture would find himself rendered unable to continue and would lose his title to Vitor via TKO by doctor stoppage. And the reasoning for this? A loose piece of stitching caught Couture's eye during the initial flurry, opening a gash up large enough, positioned awkwardly enough to warrant a doctor calling off the bout. And just like that, in 49 seconds, in a 1 in a billion event, Vitor Belfort was the UFC Light-Heavyweight Champion. As you can expect, this one was set to be run back almost before the fighters had left the cage, and just 6 months later, at UFC 49, Couture would get the chance to set the record right. And after 3 rounds of pure domination from the former champion, ironically, the doctor would stop the bout due to damage and lacerations received by the Brazilian, but this time in favour of Couture. And just like that, Vitor Belfort's 6-month reign as the UFC champion was over. Vitor would go on to cement himself as a legend within the sport in his own right, but we won't really be covering that, as we're only looking at Vitor the champion, not doing a full rundown of his career. He would go on to challenge for UFC Gold 3 more times, coming up short twice for the middleweight title against Anderson Silva and Chris Weidman respectively, and in one more bid for the light heavyweight strap against divisional GOAT Jon Jones. So back to our question. Was Vitor Belfort a legit champion? For the first time in the series, I'm going to have to say no. Don't get me wrong, Vitor is a legend, a pioneer of MMA, and someone who rightfully deserves a place in the UFC's Hall of Fame. But to call his win a fluke doesn't exactly do justice just to how lucky it was. I mean, we've seen the title change hand on disputed lucky punches before, but this has to be the luckiest of all. Not even a lucky punch as much as a lucky bit of stitching. We could just as easily award this belt to the bloke who stitched the gloves. And unfortunately, Vitor would never go on to redeem this title run through the rest of his career. In fact, the only time Vitor would go on to win more than 2 fights in a row in the UFC after this would be in his god-tier TRT Vitor era. I think as time has gone on, Vitor's title reign has just become part of his lore. I think due to the fact that we have spent a decade and a half hearing him being introduced as the former UFC Light-Heavyweight Champion, we've just accepted his title reign. But when you stop and look back at it, it's certainly amongst the weakest and most controversial reigns in the history of the UFC. But what do you guys think? Am I being too harsh? Let me know in the comments, like and subscribe if you enjoyed it guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.